You know what you couldn't say about a century ago? The T word. But you could cockfight. Welcome to 100 years ago.
The big drug companies don't want you to find out about leeches. You know why? Leeches are free. Yes, sir. I have great respect for the leech.
Leeches. You know, those slimy little bloodsuckers. Believe it or not, they used to be considered a legit medical treatment for a lot longer than you ever wanted to know. And it wasn't just a niche thing either. Bloodletting was used in ancient cultures all over the world.
I'm going to cut into his back, for I heard that it sometimes works.
Bloodletting is based on the idea that the body operates under 4 humors: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. If you're in a bad mood and someone sort of pretentiously says you're in an ill humor, it comes from the idea that your humors are out of balance. An imbalance was thought to cause all manner of illnesses and moods, so it stood to reason that letting some blood would help set things right. Enter leeches. They're literally designed to suck blood, after all. And leeching was used to treat everything from fevers to flatulence, toothaches, and even hemorrhoids.
Oh, you don't want to think about that.
By the middle of the 20th century, leeching had nearly disappeared, but persisted as a folk remedy here and there. And just in case you thought you'd only encounter the freaky little vampires if you fell into a swamp, these days, doctors and medical researchers are using leeches to test and treat everything from cancer to osteoarthritis. They're even FDA approved. Tornado warnings weren't a thing until 1948, and weather reports in the 1920s addressed this problem by avoiding the word tornado in forecasts so as not to frighten people. If you think that sounds strange, you're right, and the results were deadly. One of these see no evil, speak no evil weather warnings meant that residences of Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana were unprepared on March 18, 1925, when the deadliest tornado in American history touched down.
We know it was terrifying, and we know it did not look like a tornado. It was a mile wide, wrapped in dust and debris.
Effectively destroying 9 towns and dozens of farms along its 219-mile path, the tri-state tornado was record-breaking in its length, duration, and death toll, killing 695 people and barreling along at an astonishing average of 62 miles per hour. On top of that, storm rains several days later flooded the Wabash River, cutting off access to the affected city of Griffin, Indiana. Modern technology now gives us an average of 13 minutes of warning for approaching tornadoes, which will hopefully ensure that the tri-state tornado's death toll will never be exceeded. By the dawn of the 20th century, cities like New York depended on hundreds of thousands of horses for delivery and transportation. And horses weren't the only 4-legged city creatures. It wouldn't have been unusual to see goats, ducks, pigs, or cows in late 19th or early 20th century streets. But sometimes these animals would die in the streets. Transporting a several hundred-pound carcass is a project. Sometimes they'd be left to putrefy for a while to make it easier to saw them apart. Meanwhile, the smell of rotting flesh and disease-laden corpses were a public health hazard that few modern city dwellers could imagine.
I don't recall you being so delicate.
I'm afraid once seen, those images will remain forever in my head.
And then some. But the remains of horses weren't the only foul byproduct of the new, faster-moving society. A horse can produce between 15 and 35 pounds of manure, and up to a couple gallons of urine every day. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of horses, and you've got a serious problem. In 1894, the Times of London predicted, in 50 years, every street in London will be buried under 9 feet of manure. Thankfully, automobiles and asphalt ended the age of the urban horse, but the working equine population left behind something more constructive than road apples. In response to what some historians called the Great Horse Manure Crisis, city planning and sanitation engineers became fixtures of urban government, and remain so today. The 1920s are often referred to as the golden age of American sports, but that depended on your definition of sports. If you like watching men pummel each other to unconsciousness or animals tearing each other apart, the 1920s were your jam. Cockfighting is exactly what it sounds like, or at least I hope so. Get your minds out of the gutter. Anyway, it's 2 roosters slashing each other to death while gamblers bet on the outcome. Surprisingly, or maybe not, it's one of the world's most ancient pastimes, and it saw a revival in the 1920s. Dogfighting may be older still, but before the 20s, it was a rural thing. Come the Golden Age, dogfighting got popular in cities, maybe due to the influx of English and Irish immigrants. If you wanted to place a bet or just watch some barely controlled but sanctioned violence, you could wager on just about any competition between animals, or between men and animals, in big cities like New York and San Francisco. More traditional sports with actual human athletes were also far more brutal than today. Even the hungriest third-string football player would hesitate to play with what passed for protective equipment in the 1920s. And at the same time, the king of sports, boxing, attracted attracted thousands of spectators and international audiences on the radio. Even though bare-knuckle bouts had been largely phased out before the 20s, over 200 boxers died in the ring that decade. Before vaccines were developed to prevent common childhood diseases, infections we don't think twice about today could and did kill. As recently as 1900, a parent with 5 children could expect to lose 1 before the age of 5. Before the measles vaccine was introduced in 1963, almost everyone contracted the disease. It's that contagious. Each year in the United States, about 48,000 people were hospitalized. About 1,000 developed potentially disabling or life-threatening encephalitis, and over 400 patients died. And measles was just one of the normal childhood diseases. Diphtheria, which causes a choking inflammation of the throat, killed up to 15,000 Americans a year during the 1920s. And in the last big pre-vaccine US outbreak of rubella in the mid-1960s, 2,100 infants died shortly after birth, with another 20,000 babies born with rubella-linked disabilities. And then there's polio. Poliomyelitis, to give it its government name, has been preventable with a vaccine since 1955. Before then, it had ravaged populations as far back as ancient Egypt. The polio virus attacks the nervous system, potentially causing paralysis or weakness in the muscles connected to the affected nerves. Before the vaccine, thousands of Americans died from the disease, while many were faced with lifelong disability. Many polio survivors needed crutches, braces, or wheelchairs. Others lost the ability to breathe on their own, requiring devices like the iron lung, a canister in which a person who needs breathing assistance lives. Developed in 1927, the device creates a vacuum around the body to let the lungs passively expand, then repressurizes to force exhalation. If the electricity goes out, someone has to hand pump the machine until the juice comes back. People could and did live for decades in iron lungs, but thanks to vaccines, polio was declared eradicated in the US in 1979. But that status is subject to change. In the 20s and 30s, the United States embraced anti-Semitism as if it were a hot new trend. Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution in Europe and Russia in particular were arriving in waves. They were generally safer in the US, but not everyone welcomed them. The thing about anti-Semites is they come from all walks of life, but it was especially common among so-called elites. Harvard and other universities basically closed their doors to Jewish students beginning in 1922, admitting only a select few. Henry Ford, one of the country's richest men, had a pet project, a weekly newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, which blamed the international Jew for various moral and political ills, including World War I. For the record, he was completely wrong. Neither Archduke Franz Ferdinand, nor his assassin Gavrilo Princip, nor Kaiser Wilhelm himself was Jewish. But Hitler? Now, he loved Ford's Jew-bashing rants so much he had some of them translated and reprinted in Germany. And Ford wasn't alone. There was also Father Coughlin, a Roman Catholic priest who developed a popular, essentially fascist radio show, and American hero Charles Lindbergh, the record-breaking aviator and celebrity who toured Germany as Hitler's guest. And the discrimination went all the way to the top. When word came to the States that Hitler was planning and enacting a massive genocide, the United States doors remained closed to most Jews fleeing for their lives. Early 20th century workers went to the job at their own risk. A 1905 Supreme Court decision in the case of Lochner versus New York, a case brought by bakery employees, struck down a state law limiting the hours people could work on the grounds that Lochner's employees should be free to work 18-hour shifts if they wished. Seeing as how people needed their jobs to survive, it was at least as much a risk to look for other work and even worse to agitate for safe conditions. But in 1911, there was a deadly fire at New York's Triangle Shirtwaist Factory that killed 146 employees, mostly immigrants and women. The few available fire exits collapsed in the panic. Others were locked from the outside to keep the workers at their posts. To escape the flames, many women jumped to their deaths. There was a massive public outcry, but the factory owners were acquitted of manslaughter and actually made a profit through light insurance fraud. But the horror, which was photographed and splashed across front pages, did bring worker safety issues to the forefront. If you were brave enough to unionize and advocate for better pay and working conditions back in the 1920s, you were looking at the possibility of violent reprisals. All across the country, there were tense, sometimes bloody clashes between management and labor that could be deadly.
All of you union men, let's welcome our new brothers.
After the emergence of the Soviet Union in 1917, anti-labor forces portrayed themselves as resisting communism, a hot-button word at the time which presumably helped garner local support for beating up steelworkers. Business interests and their government allies went to astonishing lengths to maintain control. Gary, Indiana was placed under martial law in 1919. Troops were also sent to West Virginia in 1921 to intervene in a long-running dispute between miners and mine owners in which 16 people had already died. One of the labor leaders, Bill Blizzard, was later tried and acquitted for treason against the state. In the early 30s, the tension relaxed somewhat thanks to legislation that guaranteed the right to unionize. Spiritualism, a quasi-religion that can involve seances and mediums to communicate with the dead, began in about 1848, but it got hot again in the 1920s after the losses of World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic.
Your uncle who had a mustache, or your so-and-so that had this and that, whatever. He knows exactly what I'm talking about.
It even had celebrity endorsements. Sherlock Holmes creator Arthur Conan Doyle gave the movement an aura of credibility, sending the grief-stricken flocking to mediums in an effort to connect with their loved ones across the veil. You may or may not be shocked to hear that spiritualism was fertile territory for fraud. People expect proof for the hard-earned cash, so levitation, disembodied voices, and ectoplasm, a sort of magical goo some mediums claim to be able to produce, spiced up seances. What they didn't do was connect people to their dead loved ones, or even dead people they never liked much. Like polio, spiritualism is still out there. Do with that information what you will. Abraham Lincoln established the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1862, despite having quite a full inbox that year, and so began the ongoing journey of fits and starts in regard to American food safety. The Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration spun off from the USDA in 1927, soon dropping the "and insecticide" from the name. And in 1938, the new agency was empowered by legislation to set food standards in the United States. And thank goodness on behalf of anyone who eats. Consider meat. Before a steak hits your plate, there are plenty of issues, including the complicated jobs of managing live animals and preventing spoilage. Half-hearted measures intended to prevent the import of sick animals or their meat were in place in the 1860s, but lackluster enforcement meant diseased animals still arrived to spread whatever illness they had. In true American fashion, the government finally took the issue seriously when it affected sales of American meat abroad. So from 1890, American meat was inspected. Only when it was exported, though. In 1905, novelist Upton Sinclair, who'd gone undercover in meat processing facilities, used his experiences to write The Jungle, a stomach-churning polemic against bad meat wrapped in a tearjerker novel about down-on-their-luck Lithuanian immigrants outside Chicago. It flew off the shelves, became a classic, and presumably ruined quite a few dinners in the process. The novel led to 1906 legislation directing the sanitary slaughter and handling of meat going forward. Funny thing is that The Jungle was supposed to be about the wonders of socialism and how the worker was being exploited, but all anyone cared about was the rancid meat they were eating. Unfortunately, lead carbonate produces an excellent white paint. Lead white has been used since antiquity and really only has one serious flaw, but it's a doozy. It will kill you. Even with sublethal doses, lead can cause serious health issues, especially in children, and low-level lead poisoning has been blamed for spikes of violence under the theory that brain damage from lead boosts aggression. In the 1910s, Dutch Boy Paints, a subsidiary of the National Lead Company, advertised their wares directly to white letters, a likely imaginary group of everyday Americans who believed in nothing more than the superiority of lead paint. While most people don't think about paint as much as Dutch Boy executives probably hoped, the campaign does indicate a willingness to go all in on lead and spoke to the wide use of lead paint in homes. Children being children would occasionally eat paint chips and get lead poisoning, but even passive absorption from dust isn't good for anyone. The League of Nations, the forerunner to the UN, recognized the danger and banned lead paint in 1922. But the good old US of A kept painting its interior walls in lead white until 1978. Of course, paint wasn't the only source of inadvertent lead contamination in 1920s America. In 1921, scientists realized that adding certain lead compounds to gasoline made car engines run more smoothly. And even though phase-outs began earlier, the United States didn't ban leaded gasoline until 1996. The 1920s were the heyday of American organized crime, driven largely by prohibition. Americans enjoyed pretending they supported prohibition, but didn't actually want to stop drinking alcohol, so an entire criminal apparatus sprung up to satisfy the national thirst behind closed doors.
Everybody drank. The general public viewed it as just a silly law.
Another factor behind the rise of organized crime was the shaky post-war economy. In the early 1920s, unemployment and immigration were on the upswing, with too many people chasing too few jobs. The underworld was always hiring. The business opportunities offered by prohibition inspired many small organized crime outfits to consolidate, but the new bigger groups continued to fight for territory and market share. And as Americans continued to rely on illicit sources of alcohol, gang violence flared. Chicago, one of the epicenters of organized crime, was up to around 400 gangland murders a year during the 20s. Between the ready cash, the power that money bestowed, and the need to keep public officials' pockets lined in order to preserve the shady status quo, organized crime bosses began to pull political strings. Prohibition was repealed in 1933, causing the income stream from unlicensed hooch to completely dry up and sending organized crime into retreat, or rather reinvention. Some organizations dissolved, while others pivoted to drugs and other illegal activities. During Reconstruction, state and local Jim Crow laws were enacted to institutionalize segregation and perpetrate racism across the South. President Grant had driven the Ku Klux Klan into hiding in the 1870s, but by the time segregationist President Woodrow Wilson took office in 1913, KKK membership had greatly increased. Wilson seemed to do everything he could to boost their recruitment and their racist mission, from resegregating the federal government to actually hosting a private viewing of The Birth of a Nation at the White House. Side note, you probably don't have Wilson too high on your worst presidents list, but maybe you should. Anyway, for the first few decades of the 20th century, the KKK was a visible presence in many places around the country. The KKK was such an open, accepted part of American society that they would publicly sponsor festivals, family gatherings, and beautiful baby contests. The Klan hosted and officiated at weddings and christenings. They sponsored race cars and baseball teams. Sociology professor Kathleen M. Blee told NPR, "In some places I studied in Indiana, the local KKK was listed in the city directory, along with sewing clubs and agricultural societies. They even fielded candidates for public office. Their political influence was so deep that the 1924 Democratic National Convention is often referred to as the Klan bake." The United States had designs on Haiti for decades when it finally intervened there in 1915. Haiti's location made it a convenient refueling stop for American ships, and with World War I underway, the technically still neutral United States didn't want Germany to be tempted to involve itself in the Caribbean. So, after the Haitian president was killed in a grisly act of mob violence, the United States showed up and occupied the country until 1934. It's worth noting that this happened under the Woodrow Wilson presidency. See? That guy. American authorities took control of the Haitian armed forces and treasury, attempted to rework the Haitian constitution to allow foreign land ownership, and enacted a system of segregation. This goes back to Wilson again. He segregated the US government by removing blacks from government positions. Oh, did you really think he wouldn't try the same stuff in Haiti where he could? It shouldn't surprise anyone that bullying a country that owed its existence to a successful slave revolt grated on the Haitians, and a rural revolt against forced labor flared in 1920 to 21, followed by a larger resistance in 1929. When the United States forces finally left, over 11,000 Haitians had died. The society had been militarized, and many Haitians had been taught to distrust outsiders, no matter how fervently they claimed to be offering assistance.
For most of history, a newborn baby was generally viewed as one part future laborer and one part old age insurance policy. Children were expected to work from a very young age, helping around the farm, house, or business. By the turn of the 20th century, as the economy evolved and urbanization continued, children were employed in a great variety of industries and trades. The U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics keeps track of these things. They say that, in addition to the traditional farming and agricultural field labor that they'd always done, 100 years ago, rural youth could also be employed in resource extraction. That means things like mining and breaking up and hauling coal. In coastal towns, you could find children fishing, shoring, shucking oysters, or canning. In cities and towns of all sizes, children were employed by mills and factories, making everything from glass products to textiles to kitchenware to cigars. The big cities had legions of children buzzing around as couriers, drivers, cleaners, newsies, and much more. Child labor was integral to just about every level of the U.S. economy, but the children themselves usually didn't even get to enjoy their wages. Generally speaking, society saw kids as an extra money-earning appendage of their parents. On January 17, 1920, after a decades-long effort to convince Americans that society would be improved by banning liquor, the sale of alcoholic beverages in the United States was made illegal. The teetotalers were wrong, though. America turned into a bizarre mirror of itself where the government tried to poison you, while cops and politicians took their orders from the mafia and the KKK. Resistance to prohibition appeared immediately. Maryland flatly refused to enforce it, and many states and municipalities underfunded enforcement. Banning the production and sale of alcohol didn't diminish the desire, so naturally, a market emerged to supply it. And since alcohol was now a most profitable substance, bootleggers and mafia bosses who sold it had lots of money to bribe police officers, politicians, and judges.
Did 6 months for pushing heroin a couple of years back.
But you only did 6 months?
I bought a judge.
Police were openly corrupt, and since Prohibition was largely driven by racist, anti-immigrant, and anti-Catholic attitudes, it helped fuel the Ku Klux Klan's resurgent terror campaign. Thirsty Americans risked prison to buy beer, and sometimes their lives. Homemade booze, sometimes referred to as bathtub gin, killed 4 times as many people during Prohibition than alcohol did prior to banishment. By 1926, these deaths were less accidental and more deliberate. Since much of the homemade liquor was distilled using industrial alcohols, the feds increased the amount of methanol, a deadly poison required to make those industrial alcohols. Famed humorist Will Rogers quipped that, quote, "Governments used to murder by the bullet only. Now it's by the quart." Yersinia pestis is a pretty famous bacterium. It has the greatest stage name ever, the Black Death, and it rocked the 14th century so hard that 1/3 of Europe died from its effects. Bubonic plague, however, wasn't just a problem for Europeans dead hundreds of years ago. There were over 1,000 cases in the US during the 20th century. Bubonic plague is primarily transmitted by flea bites, specifically from fleas carried by rats. Rats that came to the US aboard steamships bound for San Francisco in 1900. That city's Chinatown hosted the very first US outbreak of the plague, and it scared California's leaders so much that they conspired to hide it from the rest of the country. San Francisco's mayor and the state governor, along with their willing accomplices and California's media and business titans, actually secured the collaboration of the Surgeon General of the United States in covering up the plague outbreak. At least 172 people died before the outbreak ended. The first 25 years of the 20th century saw over 500 cases of plague, and they would usually be in port towns. In 1920, Galveston, Texas was home to another outbreak. This time, the city acted quickly. The source of the disease was discovered, which, as always, was rats, and Galveston embarked on a 2-year rodent murder spree that helped end the outbreak with only 11 dead. Healthcare wasn't a pleasant experience in the early 20th century. For women, it was worse. It will probably be of little surprise that women faced challenges entering medicine, but they were also excluded from medical research for a very long time. So long, in fact, that including females in medical research trials was only made mandatory in 2016.
This exclusion probably contributed to the baffling diagnoses and treatments that women could expect.
One popular 1907 book on pregnancy instructed doctors to prep pregnant women by bathing their lady part with bichloride, which is a highly toxic substance now used primarily as a fungicide. Male ignorance of women's medicine wasn't all bad. A popular treatment to the dreaded female hysteria, whose symptoms could basically be any behavior that men didn't like, purportedly involved doctors giving patients a pelvic massage until they were satisfied. As shown in the 2012 film Hysteria, a visionary hero eventually arose and invented an electromechanical treatment, which helped to lead to today's adult toys. Eugenics is the pseudoscientific theory that humans can consciously improve the species through racism. For decades, governments around the world tried to improve their citizens. Not their lives, mind you, but the citizens themselves. Eugenics is a breeding program for humanity, essentially an effort to breed ourselves into a better species. The president of the American Natural History Museum declared in his opening address to a 1923 eugenics conference that responsible governments should make sure the individual races stay in their place and not pollute each other through interbreeding. Those who proved unfit should be sterilized. In fact, the famous Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes had some very disturbing words to say when he voted to uphold several sterilization laws. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. In all, 32 states passed some kind of eugenics law at some point. Eugenics was popular and considered progressive. Leaders of organizations like Planned Parenthood and the ACLU joined luminaries like Teddy Roosevelt and Alexander Graham Bell in supporting eugenics programs. California, with its high levels of anti-Mexican and anti-Asian attitudes, was particularly aggressive and successful. Over 20,000 Californians were sterilized in the 20th century. Healthcare might have looked scary for women 100 years ago, but mental health care was terrifying for everyone. It probably shouldn't surprise you that an era obsessed with science and new technology might produce psychiatric treatments that looked more like the work of sci-fi author Philip K. Dick than the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Treatment for mental illness was fashionable for eugenics supporters. States commonly prohibited marriage for individuals with mental illness or went one step further and sterilized them. Over 65,000 mentally ill U.S. citizens were sterilized until the last such operation in Oregon, which actually occurred in 1981. Schizophrenia could be treated with insulin shock therapy, where patients were given progressively larger doses of insulin, leaving them at high risk for brain damage.
One New Jersey doctor thought mental illness was caused by untreated infections and went on a 20-year spree of unnecessarily removing teeth, tonsils, and even organs from patients searching for the cause of mental illnesses.
He killed 30 to 45% of his victims. But it wouldn't be the early 20th century without electricity and sexism. There was electroshock therapy, which induces seizures by electrocuting the patient, and that particular therapy is still practiced today, though not to the horrific levels of 100 years ago. And even as women fought for the right to vote, there were still doctors who went so far as to claim a direct connection between women's reproductive organs and insanity. This resulted in many women sent to asylums for obvious signs of insanity, which, like so-called hysteria in the 19th century, could be pretty much anything men didn't like.